Hello everyone and welcome to this fire door inspection course, pre-learning session, which is covering fire door legislation delivered by FDM by UAP Limited. This session is aimed to last around 30 minutes, and the reason for the pre-learning session is to ensure that when you come to our training academy, you spend more time carrying out practical fire door inspections and reporting, and less time sitting in the classroom. There will be some classroom activity on your course, but this pre-learning is to give you some background information on the topics that we will be covering on the day. So the course aims and objectives. The aim of this session is to provide you with some pre-course learning on some of the legislation that applies to the installation, inspection and maintenance of fire doors. In this session, we are going to focus on buildings that are classed as multiple occupancy residential dwellings. These will be buildings such as blocks of flats, maisonettes, or houses converted into a number of apartments. We won't today be focusing on the commercial sector during this session, even though there are some crossovers between both. We will look at each of the different pieces of legislation that applies to fire doors and how to comply with that relevant legislation. The session will give you a good overall awareness of the legislation and why it is needed. At the end of the session, you will be able to explain what has driven the need for more stringent legislation relating to fire doors and why existing legislation needs to change. You will be able to identify the key legislation which relates to the installation, inspection and maintenance of fire doors in multiple occupancy residential dwellings, and you will be able to state the actions required to ensure that any fire door that you are responsible for, or you work on, or in this case you inspect, comply with legislation and what happens if they don't. So let's have a look at the session agenda for today. During our session, we will be covering the following topics so that we can meet those session objectives we just looked at. Our topics will be: why do we need fire door legislation and why are we focusing on it now? Which legislation relates to fire doors? How are we going to comply with that legislation? And what happens if we don't comply with the legislation? Finally, we're going to look at the importance of fire door inspection and legislation. So why is fire door legislation needed? Fire door safety has not always been considered highly in fire safety regulations. However, over recent years, we have seen that fire door inspections and maintenance is not just a nice-to-have process. It has become a legal requirement and a necessity to save people from having life-changing injuries or even paying the ultimate price and losing their life. On fire safety in buildings. It all started with that fateful day on the 14th of June 2017 with the Grenfell Tower fire, where 72 people lost their lives and 18 of which were children. 151 homes were destroyed by smoke and fire. The people who died in the fire were sons, daughters, parents, grandparents, partners, and they all left someone behind and left a hole in that person's life. It was a tragedy that was unprecedented and an incident that has brought about change in legislation, which means that those people who lost their lives, their relatives and their homes will never be forgotten. The whole tragedy took 15 minutes for the fire to take hold. At 12:50 a.m, a fridge caught fire on the 4th floor. 15 minutes later, at 1:05 a.m, 120 flats over 24 floors were consumed in thick smoke and dangerous flames. The Grenfell fire was the catalyst that started the conversation about things needing to change in the construction industry. Dame Judith Hackett was in charge of the inquiry to look at what happened and what needed to change. Her investigation found that a combination of poor workmanship and poor quality materials were contributing factors on the cause of the fire spreading so quickly. To share her findings, the Building a Safer Future report was published. The main outcomes of her investigation focused on two key areas. The first area was the lack of clarity of roles and responsibilities. It was very unclear who was responsible for making decisions about both the workers and the materials that were used, and there seemed to be no clear view who was ultimately accountable for those decisions that were made. Secondly, her findings said that there were inadequate regulatory oversight or enforcement tools. Her report states that there was no clear regulations to control those buildings' refurbishment and subsequent management of the building, and there was very poor enforcement and often just a rap on the knuckles rather than stringent fines or even criminal actions for breaking the rules or the law. Dame Hackett's investigations have brought around some very key changes in legislation on how high-risk buildings are both constructed and managed. The regulations now in place have put a lot of demands on the main contractor for how buildings are constructed, and also on the people who are responsible for buildings to ensure that they are maintained to the required standards. The Grenfell Tower Inquiry and fire doors. The inquiry identified that fire doors played a crucial role in preventing the spread of smoke and toxic gases from having free movement around the building by preserving the compartmentalisation of rooms and flats. A well-fitted, inspected and maintained fire door has a big part to play in containing a fire within a room or a corridor. What the Grenfell inquiry found was that fire doors fitted in the tower were not up to the standard that they should have been and did not perform in the way they should have when the fire started. This meant that the fire doors let out smoke and toxic gases into the corridors and stairwells, but it also allowed smoke and gas back into people's flats from the communal areas. One of the main outcomes from the inquiry relating to the fire doors is that anyone who owns or manages a multi-occupancy residential building should carry out an urgent inspection of all of their fire doors in their buildings, identifying those that did conform and those that do not conform, to make the required changes to those that do not conform to ensure that they're up to specification. So as you can see, having the right fire door in a building which meets regulations and complies with certain specifications is crucial, and which makes fire door inspection a vital part of fire safety for buildings and keeping residents safe. Competency is the key to safety. One of the big changes that the Building Safety Act 2022 has made is the need for people to prove that they are competent in the role that they carry out relating to building construction and maintenance. This does not just mean that the people who construct the building, but it is for everyone who is involved in the building, from the architect to the specifier, the estimator, installer, supervisor. Everyone in the chain is now accountable for the work that they carry out, and they need to prove that they are competent to have done the work if something goes wrong. If something goes wrong in a building, they will carry out an investigation to work out where or why that thing has gone wrong, and they'll look at the people who did the work to check their competency. In the future, there could be both prison sentences or hefty fines related to competency within building safety. This is why courses like fire door inspection are so important. It shows that you have been trained to carry out fire door inspections to the required standard. What a powerful video. So when a fire door has been installed to the required standard, inspected properly and maintained regularly, it will perform as it should in a fire. Similarly, if the door has been installed incorrectly, or if there are issues with the door, it hasn't been inspected correctly or on time, and issues are not picked up, if there is a fire, then the outcome can be very serious. As you could see from that video, a door that is fit for purpose will save lives. And that is the reason that we now have new legislation in place to make sure that doors are performing as they should. So now we know the reason that we need to have legislation in place for fire doors, and also what has driven the need to have this more stringent legislation in place. Now we need to have a look at actually what legislation is in place. So in this section, we're going to look at what regulations are appropriate to the installation and inspection of fire doors. As mentioned earlier, one of the biggest changes that came out of the Hackett inquiry was the development for the Building Safety Act 2022, which is now in force. There is a specific section in this Act which makes significant changes to the roles and responsibilities of all responsible people in relation to fire safety. The responsible person now needs to ensure, they need to ensure that they document and record all fire risk assessments and identify exactly who is carrying them out. They need to record fire safety arrangements. They need to register high-risk buildings with the Building Safety Regulator, and they need to cooperate with the accountable person. They also need to provide residents in the building with relevant information on fire safety. You may be asked to do this as part of your fire door inspection role. Other changes in the Building Safety Act which will have an impact on the responsible person are that some offences have unlimited fines imposed on them, and it could go into the millions of pounds. These are for things like impersonating a building inspector to carry out the inspection of a building, not carrying out specific requests on improvements that have been highlighted from a building inspector's report. So another piece of legislation you need to be aware of is the Regulatory Reform Order 2005, or could be called the RRO. This Act came into force in England and Wales in 2006, and the overall purpose of this was to bring all previous regulations relating to fire safety under one regulation, rather than on 70 pieces of regulations that were in place at that time. These regulations apply mostly to non-domestic properties, but there are some exceptions to this. A small block of flats, for instance, would fall into the regulations, as would a factory or a shop. So in a block of flats, the communal corridors and stairways are also in the scope of the fire safety order, and it also covers communal areas in a house of multiple occupation when it is rented out to at least 3 people who are not from the same family. It covers the entrance doors to flats in the communal areas, but not the flat itself. It is now known by 2 names: the Regulatory Reform Order, or the RRO, or the Fire Safety Order, the FSO. As mentioned earlier, prior to this order there were over 70 pieces of legislation which related to fire and fire safety, which made the whole process very complex and hard to understand, and even harder to interpret. The FSO outlines who a responsible person was and what their role was relating to fire safety. So who is a responsible person? Well, in the fire safety order, a responsible person was defined as somebody, in the case of a block of flats, as the person who has control over the premises in connection with carrying out the business. This could be the person who owns the freehold, could be a managing agent for the block of flats, or even a residence managing company. The role of the responsible person is to put in place policies and procedures in relation to fire safety of that building, including providing information on fire safety to residents, which was included in the Fire Safety Order in 2022. They also need to complete a suitable and sufficient fire safety risk assessment to ensure that all fire hazards are removed, control measures are put in place, and the risks of a fire starting in the building are severely reduced. So, the Fire Safety Act 2021. Sections 1 and 3 of the Fire Safety Act came into force on the 16th of May 2022. Again, this came from findings found at the Grenfell Tower. The purpose of this act was to make it a lot clearer on the type of buildings and the parts of the building that will come under the scope of the Fire Safety Order. Previously, it wasn't very clear about parts of the building or maybe the building fabric that did fall under the remits of the Fire Safety Order. So in the two new sections, it is now very clear that both external walls and fire doors, which we're talking about today, should be brought within the scope of the Fire Safety Order. The consequence of this is that the responsible person who looks after the building now needs to include both external walls, the materials they're made from, and more importantly for us, entrance doors and flat entrance doors as part of the overall building fire risk assessment. This applies to any domestic dwelling where there are two or more dwellings that have a shared communal area. We have included information on the Fire Safety Act for your information, so you are aware of where fire doors are covered in the different regulations and act. You are being trained as a fire door inspector, not a fire risk assessment assessor. So your role, unless you become trained as an assessor, is to focus only on the inspection of fire doors. So the Fire Safety Regulations 2022. This is the newest of the new regulations relating to fire safety, and it came into force on the 23rd of January 2023. The main purpose of this regulation is to put into practice the main findings from the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report. The inquiry found some failings that need to be addressed so that they don't happen again. The main purpose of the fire safety regulations was to put more onus on the responsible person for the building to carry out specific actions in relation to the fire safety of the building in order to keep people safe in the event of a fire. The action that a responsible person needs to take under this regulation is dependent on the type of building that they are responsible for. A lot of the responsibility is dependent on the height of the building. This is set out as some actions are required to be carried out irrespective of the height of the building. This could be from a one-storey building upwards. Other actions are when a building reaches a height of 11 metres, then more specific actions are required to be carried out. Again, when a building is either 18 metres high or has 7 storeys, a further set of requirements needs to be followed. So it's really important that the responsible person for each of the buildings is fully aware of the actions that they need to take to comply with the regulations for their specific building. As you can see, those regulations change for different sets of criteria. So to help us understand those requirements relating to the height of the buildings, it's quite helpful, I think, for us to show this in picture form. So for buildings under 11 metres in height, that are residential buildings with 2 or more domestic properties, they need to complete the fire risk assessment using the prioritisation tool. This is an online government tool which is used to capture the fire risk assessments that have been carried out on buildings. Secondly, they need to provide the residents with that written information on fire safety protection and procedures relating to that building. They then need to give information relating to fire doors, such as keeping them closed and no alterations, etc. For buildings over 11 metres or up to 17.9 metres, the responsible person needs to carry out those first 3 steps, but also they must carry out inspections and checks on fire doors. And for buildings over 18 metres or 7 stories, they need to do all of those previous actions and provide a lot more information. So now you can see that there is some specific information in the regulations about fire door safety and inspections. And in the fire safety regulations, there is a specific part relating to fire doors called Regulation 10. So let's have a look at that. So, Fire Safety Order Regulation 10 sets out what the legal owner or manager of a multi-occupancy residential building in England and Wales needs to do to comply with it. The regulation states that all fire doors in communal parts of a building need to be inspected every 3 months. These are doors that are found in common parts of the building, such as staircase doors, plant rooms, cupboards, cross corridor doors, and once a year all flat entrance doors need to be checked that they are still complying, and this includes self-closing mechanisms as well as other components on the doors. These flat doors usually open out onto communal areas like corridors, and the building owner needs to provide relevant and clear information on why the safe use and care of fire doors is very important for personal and building safety in the event of a potential fire. All of the above are to show that fire doors are being maintained in working order and the checks on them have been completed. All of those checks need to be carried out by a competent person who has been appointed by the building owner or manager. So there are some helpful guides out there to help the responsible person to understand what they're responsible for in terms of fire safety in a building. And a number of helpful guides have been produced, including this one on the Fire Safety Regulations 2022, which outlines how to comply with the regulations. So you can see that the new laws and regulations that are in place will have a significant impact on how fire safety is now dealt with in buildings. And your role as a fire door inspector plays a big part in ensuring that buildings, homes and people are kept safe in a fire situation. So, building regulations, quite a minefield, but approved document B of the building regulations outlines how fire safety should be applied to buildings. In approved document B, volume 1, the focus is on dwellings, and in volume 2, buildings other than dwellings. So it gives guidelines on what a person needs to do or a builder needs to do when building a new structure or extending or altering an existing building with regards to fire safety. The building regulations tell you what rating a door should be based on its scenario. there is a table there called Table C1. So, for example, a flat entrance door on a communal block of flats should be an FD30S. So it should be tested for fire resistance above 30 minutes and also undergo a test for smoke, which is indicated by the S. A notional fire door is where it has been in place for years and would have met a previous set of standards or legislation, but doesn't necessarily meet those modern standards. So Table C1 of the building regulations shows any door that forms part of the enclosure to a protected entrance hall or a protected landing in a flat as an FD20. When carrying out inspections, it is very important that you know what scenario the door is in and also if the door you are inspecting is complying with this. So let's have a look at Approved Document B in more detail. So in a number of tables in Approved Document B, it provides information relating to the types of tests that need to be carried out on fire doors and the specific standards that they should meet. In Table C1, it outlines what the expected performance requirements of a fire door set is expected to achieve. This is in terms of integrity, which is noted as an E on test information. And the term integrity relates to how long the fire door set should stay intact without breaking down or the fire burning through it. If the location of the door set required to hold back smoke as well, this is noted with the addition of S in the classification requirements in that table. In item C3 of the approved document, there is now a specific mention that the door needs to be tested from both sides, and not just on one side as they had been done previously. When reviewing test evidence, in item C4 of the approved document B, it states that the information in the test report should be checked to ensure that it gives enough information to demonstrate that it meets the requirements set out in the document that is related to the door set that is being installed in that location. There must be a way to confirm the test is for that door set. If changes are made to those set out in the test evidence information, this may significantly affect how the door set performs in the event of a fire. In Appendix Item C15, it outlines the type of hardware that is to be used on fire doors and how not using hardware of the required standards can affect the door's performance. Information on the types of hardware to be used can be found in the relevant documentation provided by the Door and Hardware Federation and the Institute of Architectural Ironmongers. I would like to show you a short video which sums up the importance of the information that we have covered in this session relating to fire door information and legislation.
The Fire Safety England Regulations 2022 come into force on the 23rd of January 2023. The regulations impose new duties on the responsible person of residential buildings. This animation is a reminder of what responsible persons need to ensure is in place in order to comply. Why were these changes introduced? Following the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry was established. Phase 1 of the inquiry made several important recommendations to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Examples of why change is necessary include the following. The Fire and Rescue Service cannot plan an effective response without information on the design and construction of the external walls. The Fire and Rescue Service cannot respond effectively if floor levels and flat numbers are not clear and easily identifiable in low visibility or smoky conditions. If the Fire and Rescue Service are not able to take control of the lifts in the event of a fire, residents might use the lifts when it's not safe for them to do so. If the lifts provided for firefighters to use are out of service and they do not know in advance, they cannot plan accordingly and fire and rescue operations may be hampered. The government's fire safety consultation ran from July to October 2020. It included proposals to implement the inquiry's recommendations in a practical way, and in some cases, to go further. The Fire Safety England Regulations 2022 were then made to bring the changes into force. The regulations sit alongside the Fire Safety Act amendments to the Fire Safety Order and the government's update of supporting guidance to improve fire safety outcomes designed to protect the public from the risk of fire. What do the new regulations require responsible persons to do? You can check your fire safety responsibilities under the regulations on the government's website. The regulations require responsible persons of multi-occupied residential buildings to take specific actions. Those actions depend upon the height of the building. Occupants of all residential buildings should be, and feel, safe from fire, so some provisions apply regardless of height. More are needed once a building reaches 11 meters. And further requirements are introduced when a building reaches 18 meters, or 7 stories, or more. In all multi-occupied residential buildings that contain 2 or more sets of domestic premises and have shared common parts, the requirements are to provide relevant fire safety information to their residents on how to report a fire, and what a resident should do once a fire has occurred, and to provide residents with information relating to the importance of fire doors. In multi-occupied residential buildings of over 11 meters in height, typically a building of 5 stories or more, the responsible person must also carry out routine checks of all fire doors in their building. This includes annual checks of flat entrance doors and quarterly checks of all fire doors in the common parts, such as doors to stairs. The majority of the requirements apply to high-rise residential buildings, at least 18 meters tall or 7 stories in height. For these buildings, the responsible person must install and maintain a secure information box for their building. This box must contain the name and contact details of the responsible person, and hard copies of the building and floor plans. The responsible person must provide an up-to-date record of the design of the external walls of the building, including the materials used in their construction. The record must also provide information on the level of fire risk associated with the external walls, and any mitigating steps that have been taken. The responsible person is required to electronically share a copy of the record with the local fire and rescue service. The responsible person must prepare up-to-date floor plans and a single-page building plan which identifies key firefighting equipment. The plans will be used by firefighters during an incident and need to be clear, simple, and easy to use. Copies of the plans must be shared electronically with the local fire and rescue service, and paper copies of the plans held within the premises secure information box. The Code of Practice for the Provision of Premises Information Boxes in Residential Buildings provides further guidance on secure information boxes, floor and building plans, and examples of best practice. The responsible person must carry out monthly checks of lifts and other essential firefighting equipment in their building. Steps should be taken to address all faults, and any faults that cannot be rectified within 24 hours must be reported electronically to their local fire and rescue service. A record of the checks should also be available to residents of the building. The regulations provide a clear list of the equipment the responsible person is required to check. These are lifts provided for the use of firefighters and evacuation lifts, inlets and outlets for wet and dry rising water mains, smoke control systems, suppression systems such as sprinkler systems, fire detection and fire alarm systems, evacuation alert systems, and automatic door release mechanisms linked to fire alarm systems. The responsible person must install floor identification signs and flat indicator signs. This signage is intended to assist responding firefighters and should be visible in low light or smoky conditions. The responsible person of a high-rise residential building must send electronic copies of the external wall record, floor and building plans, and fault reports to their local fire and rescue service. This information will allow them to more effectively plan and respond to an incident in the building. Templates have been developed to assist the responsible person with preparing the required information. They were developed with the support of fire and rescue services and ensure a consistent approach to the information being shared. Every fire and rescue service has an information sharing page on its website explaining how, and in what format, they prefer to receive the building information. Responsible persons are advised to discuss any queries with their local fire and rescue service directly. What else do responsible persons need to do? The commencement of the Fire Safety Act in May 2022 clarified that the building's structure and external walls, including windows, balconies, cladding, insulation, and fixings, fall within the scope of the fire safety order. Information related to this risk must also be included within the record of the external wall required by the new regulations. Responsible persons should update any fire risk assessments that do not consider the external walls as quickly as practicable. An online tool is available to support responsible persons to develop a prioritization strategy for updating their fire risk assessments. The Fire Risk Assessment Prioritization tool is available on gov.uk. This approach is designed to ensure that competent professionals who have the required skills to assess external walls prioritize their resources to buildings identified as high priority. The prioritization tool is not a fire risk assessment in itself, and doesn't remove the requirement for both fire and rescue services and responsible persons to act upon known or suspected risk in all premises. Where can I find out more information? The Fire Safety England Regulations 2022 can be found on gov.uk. The government has also published new guidance to support responsible persons in complying with the new legislation. And there is also a series of fact sheets available which provide further information. Early in 2023, the government will publish additional guidance to assist responsible persons with the requirement to carry out fire door checks. Thank you for watching. We hope you've found this animation a useful summary of the regulations coming into force on the 23rd of January, 2023.
So, as you can see from the information in that video, there's been an awful lot of changes over the last couple of years, and more recently especially, all stemming from the tragedy that happened at Grenfell Towers. And all of these pieces of legislation and new laws and acts are there in place to not let something like that tragedy happen again. So let's recap then what we've looked at in this session, and after you listening to the session, you should now be able to explain what has driven the need for fire safety and fire door legislation, which related back to the fire in Grenfell. You should be able to identify those key changes and new pieces of legislation relating to the fire and look at what they mean. We have also spoken about what actions need to be taken by the responsible person in charge of buildings to ensure compliance with various legislation. So we've come to the end of this pre-learning webinar session. You will have been sent 2 webinar links. So in webinar 2, we'll be focusing on fire door components. Thank you very much for listening, and we're really looking forward to welcoming you to the training centre shortly for your fire door inspector course.